We are back sooner than I thought for a sequel, and I'm very, very excited. This is the Reader's Choice 100 Books of the 21st Century so far, and I'm really excited to talk about these. These are books that I generally like better and have read more of, which I love. And does that make me a common reader? Probably. I don't care. I think some of the reasons and expectations of fine literature, etc. are just dumb. So those are my 2 cents on this. I have read 24 of the 100 of these, which is still not great, but I DNF'd another 5 or so. I didn't really count how many books that I DNF'd on the first list, which was a fair bit, but I have DNF'd a fair amount of these books as well. But I want to talk about the ones that I really like. If you want to hear my thoughts on the whole list of the Critics' Choice, I will leave that linked below. I talk a lot about the books, and they're generally books that I don't like, but if you like sassy content, it's there. Taking it from the top, the first book that I'm going to talk about is at number 21, Homegoing. When I made my personal ballot, I included Transcendent Kingdom by her on this list. I really love her as an author. She's really fantastic. And she's probably one of the authors I was most shocked to not see on the Critics' Choice. Directly below it is Normal People. This is a book that I liked. I read it a number of years ago, so I don't have as clear of a memory, but I really like Conversation with Friends by the same author. And I really flirted with putting this on my list as well, because I think that it's such a good book, and it deals just so tenderly with relationships and the different ways that we are in relationships with others. It also really deals with infertility and painful periods and topics that are just not talked about but are so prevalent in the population. Madeline Miller went from having no books on the list to having 2. I really like Circe. I read it, I don't know, 6 years ago, and then I read Son of Achilles about 4 or 5 years ago, and I really liked both of them. The number 1 book that I was shocked was not on the original list was The Kite Runner. For a long time I said it was my favorite book of all time, but I have not read it now in 10 years, so I feel like I need to reread it in order to say that, but I am afraid. It is probably the first literary fiction modern book that I read, because I read it in grade 12 English, and yeah, I really liked the experience. It was so wonderful to read a book that was about a contemporary issue and to really dive into it, and the writing is so beautiful. The characters are amazing. I love writing essays about this paper, and I'm really glad that my teacher chose it as the book that we would study. I think this was such an important book for me to read and to understand the landscape and like understand Afghanistan and the conversations about the Middle East during this era. Like, I listened to a podcast by the New York Times that kind of discussed this list and they're putting it together, and they talked about 9/11, and I was like, this is a book that should be talked about in conversation, because it talks about the kind of behind the scenes of that. It talks about how America fought a proxy war that destroyed a country. And then we talk about the Taliban and the ways that when you crush people, they tend to become radicalized. It's similar to what we see happened in Germany during the First and Second World War. You know, neither of those things are justified, and the actions that were taken by those countries in the aftermath. You really see the way that America and other countries intervening and putting their feet into different countries, and that has global effects. And it's also a very personal story about immigration and about fatherhood and about abuse and surviving abuse. It's just such a great book, and I am afraid to reread it because I love it so much, and what if it doesn't live up to it, because like I had never read a book like this before, but I do think that it's going to hold up. I'm just afraid. The next book I want to talk about is The Hunger Games. It exists behind me at all times. I was so wowed when I reread this in 2020. I was worried again that it wouldn't hold up, and I liked it even more. And I think that it's a book that really got pulverized because people don't like books that are written by women for women, especially girls. And I think that is a really tender exploration of grief and dictatorship and the cost. And there's so much conversation and like griping and making fun of the love triangle, and like so much of the conversation isn't actually about love or lust or any of those things. It's really about her thinking about the fact that does she want to reproduce in a time in which any child she has a chance of going through the horrors that she's gone through. And I hate that conversations like that happen in the book become a punchline in media. I also think there's a merit in talking about love and love stories. Like, we talk about love stories because they're one of the most universal experiences of people. So yeah, I think that this book deserved to be in the Critics' Choice, and I'm really glad to see it on this list. At the end of the last video, I talked about what my ballot would be, and that was a very quick overview. I kind of just looked at the top 100 books that I had chosen and like picked off there, and I didn't look at it as closely. And as soon as I thought about it further, I was like, why didn't I mention Know My Name by Chanel Miller? It is one of the best books that I've read in recent years. It deals with a sexual assault and the aftermath and the conversations about that. And it is also just incredibly well written. Like, the metaphor and the description and showing the pain, but also showing healing in such a tender way, and holding space when we're talking about tension between 2 topics of like talking about how much this affected her while not letting this define her. Like, it's just such a well balanced and good book. I think that it's a really important book that talked about a conversation that we've been having more and more as the 2000s have gone on. The number 73 pick I will briefly mention is Harry Potter. I was surprised that this wasn't on the list in the first place. Obviously, it began in the 20th century, but it was one of the biggest phenomenons of the 21st century, and, you know, despite all of the gripes we may have with the author and with certain things, it is a well-written book that really launched 1,000 ships of fantasy. So I think that this is a well-deserved book on the series. I alluded to this book in my original list when I talked about Never Let Me Go and how I really love Claire and the Sun, so I was really excited that this is a book that really got its praise in here. Claire and the Sun, I think, is just such a great book and really looks into so many conversations that we're having and continue to have, and it's just hauntingly written. I read it 3 years ago and I still think about it often. One of the books that I flirted with having on my nonfiction list was The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. So I was really happy to see this on this list. It is a story about a Black woman who had cancer in the 1930s, and unknown to her, her samples of her blood were taken, and because of sciencey things that I don't really understand, her blood was huge in many treatments for cancer, and yet her family remained uncredited and her story remained unknown, and she herself died of cancer shortly after that. So it's a really interesting story, talking about the science, talking about rediscovering her, and kind of just, it's very personal while also very scientific, and also looks at the history of the exploitation of Black people. One of the books that I mentioned would be on my ballot is In the Dream House. It is an incredible book that looks at abuse and looks at the ways in which that happens silently and happens in relationships. It also uses literary and Gothic tropes to really deconstruct this and discuss this, and it is just brilliantly written. And yeah, I really think this is a great book to be on this list. I think that Brit Bennett might be one of the authors that people kind of turn up their nose about and they're like, popular fiction, da 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 da. And I've seen that and I disagree with it. I think that she is a brilliant author. I think The Vanishing Half is a great story. I was tempted to put her other book, The Mothers, on this as her debut novel, and I thought it's such a great book. I really love stories of people growing up together and their complicated relationships. I looked at my ballot and I was like, oh, I have themes. I have thoughts about messy relationships between either sisters or families or people in general, like marriage relationships, all of those things. I like a messy relationship. I think that both of her books deal with really messy relationships and complex relationships with so much heart. And then last but certainly not least, we have A Man Named Ova by Frederick Bachman. I included Beartown on my ballot. I'm a big fan. Several of his books are some of my favorite books. This was the first book that I read, and I didn't like it at the time, but I think I misunderstood it. I wasn't as acquainted with him as an author, and I had some gripes with the end, and I have a whole video. It's an old video about me complaining it. But yes, I think I really want to reread it. I would really like to see how my opinion is 5 years later from the time. But yes, I really like this list, and I like this list better. And I was thinking about this when I was grabbing books, that I do kind of purposely sit myself in this corner of my bookshelves. I have so many bookshelves, and this one is a really long one, and it has 5 or 6 shelves and they're very long. But I kind of sit here purposely because these are my like literary fiction. There's some translated lit, there's a little bit of classics like some Gothic books here. There used to be all my poetry, but it became overflowing, so now they're in the hall. And then up here I have Narnia and some adult fantasy, and then also my comic books a little bit off screen. And then here I have a bunch of YA fantasy and, like, you know, The Hunger Games and The Lunar Chronicles. I have Scythe by Neil Shusterman, one of my favorite books, and Percy Jackson. Just a lot of books that I really love. And then up here are all my classics. You know, I have my Penguin and my Artemis classics, and, you know, a little bit off screen here you can kind of see that I have my Lucy Maud Montgomery collection. So, like, I really love sitting here because I'm a person who refuses to be put into one genre or another. I don't want to be a person who only reads classics. I don't want to be a person who only reads literary fiction or only reads fantasy or only reads any of the different genres that I read. So I really love sitting here because I think that you can kind of see around me that these are many books that I like, and that I'm not just going to like one kind of book. I always hope that that is somehow subconsciously or consciously portrayed to people as they look at me and as they look at my shelves, that, oh, this is a girl who reads a lot of different things. So yes, I would love to hear your thoughts on this list. Do you love these books? Do you hate these books? Which list do you think is better? Battle of the lists, I would love to hear it. And yeah, tell me which book you think that is still being snubbed, which book that you are so excited made it to this list. And I will talk to you soon.